Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are studying our second session of the day. It's called Graduate Student Success and Wellbeing, and I would like to introduce the chair for the session, Daniel Jones-White, Managing Director of the Zero Consortium, and also Grad Zero Research and Development Director. Daniel?
Thank you, Igor, and thank you everyone for attending this session today. We're very fortunate to have some outstanding researchers and practitioners from the University of Iowa, and the University of Michigan, and the University of Oklahoma. And I hope that everyone had a chance to watch their videos before they attended, because they were fantastic. I'm going to make the order. I'm going to allow each of our presenters about 5 minutes to describe their research. And I'm going to go in the order that Igor presented to me, because I think it does a really good job of introducing different ways to look at or think about graduate education. So first up will be University of Iowa, who will talk about their multi-institutional approach to studying graduate student success and well-being. Then we'll hand it over to University of Michigan, who will talk about a longitudinal effort to study graduate student experience. And then we'll go to the University of Oklahoma, who started introducing new interventions and then are using Grad Zero as a way to try and help assess how they're working. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Nicholas Stroup from the University of Iowa to introduce his team and his research.
Hello. So good evening from Pristina, Kosovo. We are excited to be this Iowa team, none of whom are actually right now in Iowa talking to you today. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, Cassie Barnhardt, who is the Associate Professor of Higher Education, who is also here and stuck at the embassy. SuYeong Shin, who is at UC Irvine as a postdoctoral researcher, and Shinji Katsumoto, who I believe I see in the room. So it's good to see you, Shinji. And he's in New York City right now. I think to give you just kind of some background on us, the presentation that you watched in the YouTube video really had a lot to do with our different ways of approaching multi-institutional CERU data. Because we are so interested in the graduate student experience, for me, I arrived at my graduate student experience because I was interested in the experiences of graduate students, in particular, very meta. Cassie approached this work because many of her dissertation advisees were considering the role of graduate student experiences and culture in the field of higher education, and then beyond into larger professional spheres, and the role of the academy in civic engagement. And then for Shinji and SuYeong, both of them have a lot of work that relates to the experiences of international students and scholars related to mobility and student success. And so we all came here with different angles on this particular topic. And our research team also comprises a number of other students and scholars who look at problems in different ways, bringing a lot of their own personal journeys into the work as well. Where we kind of met up for this set of studies has a lot to do with the time that people spend in doctoral programs specifically, and thinking about those questions of what am I doing this for? Why am I doing this to myself? And will I be prepared to do what I want to do when this is done? And one of the things I've gone on record before saying I think CERU is the best survey to be able to answer some of these phenomenological questions about student motivation and campus culture. And there's nobody else that really gets at this stuff, especially because we know that getting a doctorate is hard, but there are some very clear outcomes. And academic careers often require those clear outcomes. And in particular, global communities, holding a doctorate confers special standing. So we wanted to know about a number of these experiences and think a bit into how different journeys are shaped and reshaped by students' ambitions and for students' ambitions for their doctoral careers. So in our video, we talked a little bit about parenthood and academic careers. We talked about the preparation of international doctoral students in going out and doing civic work and global work. and also interest among international doctoral students to work at different institutional types, teaching institutions, research institutions, and what is it about our campus communities for doctoral education that's really providing students the space to be able to explore these dimensions of their academic careers. So I think that's a bit of an overview of what we talked about and how we show up. And I look forward to the Q&A session throughout. And oh, hi, SuYeong, I see you on the call now too. So it's good to see the team all together.
Sorry, I was trying to make a joke. I was saying, thank you, Nick, for saying that. And just so everyone knows, we don't pay him to say that, but we might have to start. So we definitely appreciate his commitment to grads here. Next up, it's my privilege to introduce John Gonzalez from the University of Michigan, who is able to talk to us about a longitudinal study that they're doing at Rackham Graduate School on the doctoral student experience. John?
Thanks, Daniel. Many thanks to my research team, who is unfortunately not here, but this is truly a team effort of many of our graduate students and as well as team members. So we take a longitudinal developmental approach to our trying to understand the doctoral student experience. We happen to really think that we don't understand much of the sets of systems and processes that are happening in that often lengthy process of doctoral development. And so we've built what we think is a set of constructs and measures that over time should help us at first understand how these things move over time, and then obviously a long-term effort. And then after we understand that, hopefully we can learn their interaction. And so over the last 5 years, we've looked at how things like academic identity and identities as researchers and scholars develop, how those are intertwined with notions of well-being, both physical and mental, and then the interaction of those areas with stress, among others. We measure climate, we measure motivation, we measure a number of other constructs in our study, but our approach is sort of multifold, if you will, in that first we really don't think, for example, that we understand how well-being changes over time. So there's a question posed around, is it bad that well-being sort of drops? Well, it probably is, but we don't actually understand if it rebounds or not. And so our study has allowed us to see, for example, with the complications of COVID, what that does as an addition to the experience of graduate school to well-being and mental health and stress. So there are a number of factors there that are facilitated by our longitudinal approach. Our study is also a cohort study, so we include a single cohort every year. So we're also able to explore the differential baselines across sets of students starting at different times. And what we hope to do is eventually to map this to early career development of scholars, and to see how that trajectory over time intertwines with the sort of nascent points of doctoral student development at the very early years of doctoral education.
Awesome. It's a very cool study, and I look forward to continuing to follow it as it develops, because there's not a lot of other research like this going on right now. So, and it's able to answer questions that other studies like GradSo just simply aren't. So really, really cool. And finally, it's my privilege to introduce Sherri, Irvin, and Liz Karr from the University of Oklahoma, who will talk about some of the cool things that they're doing to actively try and improve wellness and success for graduate students. Sherri?
So I'm the Senior Associate Dean in our grad college, and I'm also a full professor in the philosophy department. I joined our grad college 4 years ago at a time when graduate education had really been a low priority at OU. It was really all about the undergrad experience. And about 4 years ago, a light bulb came on in a few offices that we really needed to prioritize our research enterprise, and that the graduate student experience was going to be key to that. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of energy around graduate education, supporting it. And there's also energy around growing our online professional master's programs for different reasons. And kind of both of those areas, the research areas and the professional online programs, fall under our purview. So we've really been trying to think about, get engaged with institutions all over the place to understand their org charts and understand what they're doing, and think about what can we build here at a time of increasing energy, but still not as many resources or as many staff members as we want. But we have been able to grow. And so I'm here with, we now have a second associate dean, my colleague, Liz Karr.
Hi, I'm Liz Karr. Like Sherri said, I'm the associate dean in the graduate college. I've been in the position for 2 years now. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Microbiology and Plant Biology. And before coming to this position, I spent 3.5 years as the director of the graduate program there, which was also a lot of experience in dealing with the graduate student experience within that program, which kind of launched me into this position, sort of working with students as they were struggling through the program and in their experience. And Sherri and I really often work together in sort of our different backgrounds and experiences in our own graduate student experiences and in our own programs to try to bring different viewpoints to the table to implement different strategies as we work with students and programs to improve the experience of graduate students during both their master's and doctoral degree progress.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So this is a question and answer section. So we'll kick it off with, I'll ask a few questions to get the panel warmed up for all the better questions that are set to come. But yeah, let's kick it off with a question about what success means for graduate students. We use the term a lot, but I'm not sure that we have sort of a common understanding in terms of what it means to be successful as a PhD student. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Should everyone who starts a graduate program be expected to earn a degree? And if not, how do we sort of resolve that tension or the different set of expectations between what students bring when they come into a doctoral program and what the college or program expects in terms of how many of them will be successful?
I can kick us off, I guess. It's just by virtue of being first in the order. I think framing it as a tension is the way to go about this, because we sit so often with success for whom. If we're talking about success as in the best interest of the institution, we are often talking about questions of completion rates, persistence, time to degree, things that are easily calculated and reported out as evidence of efficiency. And what sometimes gets lost in the shuffle is the kind of beautiful collisions that happen in a graduate program, the scientific discoveries. It's hard to measure when a scientific discovery is going to happen. You can't just check a box. The new way of looking at things, the shifts in a student's thinking, there are ways to assess that, but regular assessment of those things is difficult. So we often see success measures kind of brought down into those lenses of being in the best interest of the institution. And so some of the things that we talked about were measures of success that are related to either the field as large or the individual student. So things like feeling supported, things like feeling prepared, things like feeling confident about a career track. Those kinds of things are different kinds of successes. And so we propose some ways of looking at outcome measures that are captured in Grad CERU that might not normally be considered success, but are ways to frame notions of success through society serving events. SuYeong, is there anything you'd like to add? I know you had some things with that section too.
When I'm looking back my graduate experiences as a student, international students, I think the one thing I really appreciate is from my grad school experience that I could realize who I am, what kind of value and the mission is very important to me, and I could understand better myself. So I could keep continuing my academic journey after graduation. That was one thing. Other than that, I think this discussion is also related to the later part of our discussion, which is how then we can distinguish this type of certain level of stress is normal or not, right? Because it's our life, part of life, continuing life. So
I'll piggyback off of that a bit, and I think success has to be a multifaceted kind of thing. Nick points to the success for whom, which is right. There is a tension between the institutional goals and the personal goals of students that is often at odds with one another. It shouldn't be, but it often is. And so I think very much we've this doesn't come from me, it comes from folks around the university. We've been kicking around the completion as a whole term, the notion of holistic completion, if you will, that it's better to not complete than to complete and be broken in a shell of yourself. That there's so doctoral education has a cost. It's not free, not just a monetary cost, but it has a cost to our identities. It has a cost clearly to our well-being. And the balance is that cost worth it? I think that's fundamentally a personal question, but it's also a question that should be aligned with the goals of the institution to resolve that question, right? Because if we are indeed becoming the cause of this highly incurred cost, then that is a problem, and it's not our mission and our goal to produce these kinds of costs which are permanent and perhaps unreversible. So I would think of that very much within this framework of what is the cost and the benefit, if you will, and for whom is that benefit being carried upon, if you will.
Yeah, I really fundamentally agree with a lot of what John just said. I kind of think of success as, there's academic success, there's sort of professional exploration and preparation, and there's the flourishing as a whole person. And I think all three of those are really important. In terms of persistence, I think that sometimes a student really comes to a legitimate realization that this isn't the best course for them. But I've also sometimes heard academic units use that as an excuse. They have high attrition rates and they're like, well, it's just normal, but a bunch of our students realize this isn't for them. And I think that comes back to those costs that John was just talking about. Sometimes those units are imposing very intense costs on students, and those students could have and might have very much wanted to be successful on their academic pathway and are being driven out by harms they're experiencing.
I'll just add to that. Yeah, I think when it comes to the persistence piece, it's really certainly there are going to be students that enter a graduate program really not understanding or knowing or anticipating what graduate school is going to be or what it'll be like, and decide that it's not for them. But there will be some that do and want to continue, but maybe don't feel the support from their departments that and then the department will use that sort of excuse of, well, they're just not ready. And so I think we have to separate those two things. And then in terms of success, I think a lot of people use those, metrics of, they're publishing, they're doing all of these things, and they're being successful in that way. But does that really matter if they were miserable the whole time? And so I think that's a key thing to look at. Is they should be able to have all those things and be excited about it and want to celebrate it, and have enjoyed the experience and be able to look back on it, and encourage others to go down that path because they had a good experience.
Awesome. So I'm trying to see, there's a lot of good ideas there, and I'm trying to see where I want to sort of jump off to next. I think I want to jump off the trade-off, the comments about trade-off and well-being changes over time that a couple of people have sort of mentioned. I'm curious, both, I have a nascent thought that I'm going to try to make into something comprehensible, but the larger question is, should pursuing a doctorate be stress-free? And how do we distinguish between the normal type of pressure associated with pursuing a doctorate from those that are much more harmful? And John, one of the things that your research really sort of has me sort of thinking about is this idea of, what are the impacts? And so as we track sort of wellness in terms of depression rates, anxiety rates, sense of mental health, we sort of see this increase over time, but I'm curious about the potential for attrition feeding that cycle, right? If it's the case that people with strong mental health are either getting out early or potentially leaving because the costs are too high, is it the case that what we're sort of observing is that, it's those people that are kind of trapped in a bad cycle or a long or prolonged cycle that we're seeing as suffering? So again, nascent thought, I'm not sure it's 100% comprehensible, but I'm curious kind of your thinking, or if your research has been able to parse out or tease out some of those effects in terms of attrition, and everyone else's comments about stress.
Yeah, lots of good questions. So we haven't noticed that attrition is it's a self-selector. So we haven't noticed a survival bias, right? Which is what you're basically getting to, right? That the people who survive, the opposite, which is that they're surviving, but they're not thriving. So in fact, the cohorts that we're analyzing have some of the highest potential completion rates. So we're not seeing a lot of people drop out. We do have, even though we have high response rates, we do have a small concern about the non-respondents, and we have done some efforts to do outreach to them, and typically the answer isn't, I don't want to deal with you. It's like, I forgot, I don't have time, which is kind of a normal thing. So we don't particularly think that there's a non-respondent bias either. What I think there is a factor of play is that we don't often think about is that people do come in with different levels of both well-being and stress. There are people who come with pre-existing challenges to those well-being effects, right? And so people who are already struggling with mental health, people who are already struggling with stress management, and it seems to us, based on some of our analysis that we've done, that baselines are really critical and important, and people who start out already challenged are the ones that are really challenged the most over time. And so we've been able to identify these profiles where the biggest slope change downwards are associated with people who start out low to begin with. The people who start out high retain that, if you will, they don't drop as fast. And so I think that speaks to this variability at the beginning, which suggests that there should be some tailor individual approach, and that we should acknowledge that that this isn't all undergraduate schools and the programs and the school colleges, that there is a factor of personal kind of struggle, right? We all have different situations. We're caretakers, partners, a number of things that influence our ability to function in this process, and that's going to influence all of these things. And so I think that individualized kind of baseline is really critical, and intervening at those areas would be probably wise things to do, in my guess.
So then another question that I have is, one of the things that we like to say that's the Sherri survey and grad service survey has really sort of helped us sort of identify is that there's no single student experience on campus, right? There are several different student experiences, But I'm starting to wonder about the way that that is being framed in terms of whose responsibility this is. I'm curious, Nick, I'll maybe start with you, but at what point might we think that, you know, rather than it being a different experience, what we're actually observing is different pathways to being successful in graduate students?
Yeah, I think there may be different pathways, and we know that disciplinary factors play in here, identity-based factors play in here, and life course factors play in here. I wholeheartedly agree with what John just said about where people begin is a big predictor of where they will go. Where we might think about pathways specifically is how do we build supports for those students who are on different pathways. What are the kinds of accommodations we can be making based upon what we know from research about what those trajectories will look like? I think that collectively all three of these groups have talked about some of those ways of thinking about the student experience more holistically, and not just necessarily in terms of a pathway in and a pathway out, but the pathway during. We have lots of research about the outcomes and where people start, but it becomes difficult to know what's going on midway. I think about when we were studying the experiences of caregivers and what happens along the way. Well, there's actually a surprising kind of bonus to being a caregiver and being confident and being able to get the job that you want at the end and feeling like you will be successful. But does that come from a survivor bias? And do we know if those are students who had a child for the first time in the middle of their program? No, we don't. And so what we would like to be able to do is think about some of those other kinds of questions about the pathways and build resources from there. And I think that's where research can really inform practice in practical ways.
Daniel, I can speak to your question of like who's responsible for this stuff. As a, I'm in an institution where, as we said, like grad education was really neglected. So I tend to take a pretty expansive view of my own responsibility. There are some academic units where they're doing a great job of this, and some where there really aren't. And so I just feel like we at the graduate college level have to try and figure out what we can do, what interventions can we do to shore this up. And Grad Seru has been a great tool for kind of identifying, sometimes reinforcing what we already knew, but giving data that we can refer to make the argument to the folks in that area that, hey, this is not what we're seeing is not actually normal. It's not typical for your discipline. But yeah, we're really trying to figure out what levers can we pull at the institutional level to help to move the needle on this stuff.
So for our last question before we open it up to the audience, the team from Iowa, Nick, I think you were the one that actually said it, but I really like this idea that you mentioned about the role that Grad Seru data or data can play in sort of helping to shift conversations. Especially, so I'm curious, and I think to shift, to difficult conversations. I'm curious, like from everybody's perspective, what conversation. People in the audience are in different points of their journey in terms of what kind of data they're collecting on graduate students and how they're sort of including it. So my question is, what difficult conversations should we be having on campuses as it relates to graduate student wellness and success that we currently aren't, or that we weren't having 4 years ago?
So I can start with, I think, two conversations. They're related to our conversation here. One is success. Like, I think one of the interesting things about our study is that it has really forced people to think about what success means. And it was one of the first questions we asked our deans and leadership. What is success? Do you really just care about completion, or is there some other kind of more ambiguous notion that you want us to try to capture? And I think that's actually a really difficult conversation, because it's a messy question, right? Like, the idea that a completion is not alone is not success is kind of mind blowing to administrators, right? Like, what? Like, our completion rates are 85%. You're doing great, right? So I mean, I think that's uncomfortable for especially for non-grad ed kind of administrators, the provost, right? How do they react to that question in a kind of very surprised way? That's not the way we're used to looking at that. I think the second kind of uncomfortable conversation we should be having is a parallel conversation to this financial aid, right? So I think in doctoral education, we decided a while ago that that we should at least to some degree support students. And now here at Michigan, we have a full funded model for 5 years. So finances have that's been settled. I think we should ask that same question about well-being. If we are not able and capable of supporting a student well in those areas, then should we even take them? And I don't mean that to say that we shouldn't take students that have mental health challenges or that suffer from mental health illness. It is to say that it is that question of responsibility. When a student comes to our institutions, they become our responsibility. And so not shepherding students through those difficult moments is indeed a failure. And if we can't accept that failure, and if we can't sort of say we have the resources, the mechanisms in place to support students, then we should really ask ourselves the questions of, should we be engaging in this enterprise at this kind of scale if our very intervention might itself be harmful?
I'll add a few other things with just kind of the difficult conversations. Difficult conversations are difficult because they're taboo, and we don't want to kind of bring up difficult topics sometimes. We know that stigma exists in a couple different areas in graduate education, whether it's career seeking, getting the right kind of job. There's a lot that has been done about whether faculty jobs or jobs outside of academia are valuable and whether students are feeling like they are prepared to pursue them. And bringing up those conversations repeatedly, especially in different disciplinary areas, can be difficult, especially if it's that you use a 85% completion rate. Yeah, that's really great. And are those students feeling like they can get the job that they actually want at the end? It's really hard. I think we are also in a very changing world. And so the ability to do work that affects the world at large, if we are graduating students, but they're not prepared to meet the challenges of today, I know that sounds kind of buzzwordy, but to work with people who are very different than them, and that includes across national lines, across identity lines, across lines of difference about what the role of education even is, that becomes a very important sticking point when talking to program directors and deans about what they're doing to actually make sure that people take responsibility for that kind of preparation, because oftentimes it is in the hands of faculty to institutionalize certain things in the curriculum. Then the final thing is just what kinds of institutions are desirable for people who are going on the job market in academic roles. There are stigmas against institutions that are primarily teaching institutions, especially among graduates of research institutions that produce the largest number of doctoral degree holders. So how do we expand students thinking about the kinds of places that they can work and want to work? And what does it mean when students are receiving different messages, especially based upon the training that they've received?
Can I jump in for a second? Of course. Yeah, during my postdoc here, Irvine, I could enjoy lots of opportunity to meet other postdocs in different disciplines. And most of them are in STEM field. And their grad experience is much more lab-based than the department-based or the school-based. So maybe in our grad survey data set, we might want to includes some more contextualized survey items for across different disciplines. Their experience is much more shaped by their PI and their lab other colleagues and their other students and their postdoc seniors like that. And also there is a kind of awareness of the risk of suicide, typically during the lab experience, lab kind of education. That is one thing I could find. And also they are, I'm not sure if I say they, but those the postdoc or grad student in Stanford, they pursuing job in non-academia, and that's not kind of their alternatives. They sometimes prefer to work in the company or even pursuing the job, career opportunity at startup. That's something desirable thing for themselves. So I think we can, widen up our mind, kind of idea and get some more now changing the context here in the zero survey. Thank you.
I'd say one kind of difficult conversation that we've been triggering on our campus relates to what counts as quality mentorship. And we've triggered this in part through recently revising our graduate faculty charter, which is the document that kind of specifies who can belong to the graduate faculty, who can teach classes, who can serve on and chair master's and doctoral committees, and what are the criteria for that. We've asked academic units to include in their new version of those criteria to spell out what counts as quality mentoring in your discipline. Try to have that conversation and put something down in writing about how you understand that. And also try to put down in writing what kinds of things would trigger you to rescind or reduce somebody's status on the graduate faculty. So to try and acknowledge what kinds of things might be going on and create some, give our policy some teeth if we do need to take action when a faculty member is identifiably abusive to their mentees.
Thank you. Now I could ask questions all day, but I know that we want to allow the audience a chance to interact with our fantastic panelists. I'm going to go, Andrea posted a comment or a question for you, John. Andrea, if you're available and want to ask it, I'll yield the floor to you.
Yeah, sure. So I was really interested in your finding regarding mentoring, where the subjective rating didn't necessarily have the same predictive qualities. That's something that was a little more objective and kind of behavioral, where that was like more predictive, like looking at have you discussed or written up a mentoring plan? So I was wondering if you'd seen other similar examples where there was kind of that disconnect between something more kind of behavioral versus something that was more like a subjective satisfaction rating. And then further, did you see any patterns, maybe by demographic or something else, where maybe certain groups of students were more likely to have that kind of disconnect between these behavioral measures and then the satisfaction, where maybe they over-reported satisfaction?
Yeah. Thanks. Great question. So we wrote a paper about one of these, which is so we have a subjective notion of knowledge about your discipline, and so we ask, sort of how strong do you feel about the knowledge in your discipline as a prior knowledge, content knowledge kind of measure. And there are tremendous differences in that, especially there are great gender effects where women rate themselves much lower than men, and especially minority women tend to do it even more so. And so we actually correlated that to not a great proxy, but nonetheless a proxy that is a feedback proxy, GRE scores. And so we said, okay, well, let's control for GRE scores and say, does that matter? And we actually found out that women on average had higher GRE scores than men. Nonetheless, they rated themselves lower. So they were perhaps more self-aware, but also there are societal, obviously, messages that are being ferried across there. So I think this is kind of a larger point about surveys, finding those not necessarily, I hate the word objective, but but perhaps less subjective indicators that might point to a behavior or a particular pattern. There's probably lots of interesting cases of that. That's the one I can think of right off the top of my head.
Thank you, Andrea. Igor, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question too. So first of all, I enjoyed all the presentations and really learned a lot. I have lots of questions, but I try to limit myself. I have a question to Sherri and Liz. In your presentation, you talk about some difficult cases where you had, dealing with programs, and I was wondering, when you kind of as a decision maker and working in a graduate division, when you work with like programs where you observe a lot of toxic relationships between students and advisors or some other challenges, how do you think the data is actually helpful in these cases, or something else is needed to make it happen? Because in many cases, this programs or departments or schools are not interested in kind of a self-improvement. But do you think that kind of a data is helpful at all in these cases, or something else, works better? What's your experience? I'm just curious to learn more about that.
I think we've had both experiences. We've had an experience where there was enough going on where we were able to go in prior to having the data from Grad CERU and say, this is something has to change. And we go in with a variety of campus-wide partners when we do that. But when we got the Grad CERU data, it was abundantly clear from that data the issues that we were already aware of. But there were other instances where having the data reinforced some things that we had anecdotally been aware of from various smaller situations we were seeing. And it just allowed us compiling that with, some of our completion data, and attrition data, things like that we were able to go in and work with the programs to work on sort of what we would deem weed out culture surrounding sets of exams and other instances in terms of the climate that students are feeling is taking place in a particular unit. So the data has been pretty helpful, because I would say the programs are pretty shocked to see that these things, or that this is how their students feel. There's a big disconnect in many cases.
Yeah, I totally
Sherri
agree.
wants to add to
No, I was just going to say, just the ability to benchmark against all the other programs on our campus, and then to benchmark against other programs in similar disciplines is really valuable, because sometimes you've just got people like, oh, it's just normal, grad students are unhappy, what are you going to do? And I think the benchmarking capability is very valuable to debunk that strategy.
Tangshan, you have a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your analysis, your experience. This is a great panel. So my question is, which may not be directly related to your presentation, but I would like to know, based on your probably other analysis or experience working in this area, so what opportunities or academic activities could have been improved or offered by graduate programs, particularly for doctoral students who would like to pursue an academic job in the future, or in terms of their development of competencies that may be required for teaching or research.
Or maybe even mentoring, because I think that's something that's really missed. We just have a tendency to mentor how we were mentoring. So some mentoring training within the lighter years of the doctoral experience, I think, is something that is greatly overlooked.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a direct answer to that question about the specific supports for academic training, because I think the data that GradZero has is so rich to be able to look at individual comparisons there. But when we look at some of the predictors, we know that preparing students for a wide range of academic careers is something that could be a really great opportunity for universities to invest their time and energy in. There is a lot of work done around socializing graduate students to academic careers through research projects, through TA-ships and things that are kind of seen as the typical, essentially do the work of professing before you become a professor. But one of the things that research universities specifically have trouble with is preparing students to think about the culture of teaching at, say, a liberal arts college or a community college. What might those academic pathways and careers look like that are still allowing students to pursue an academic career that involves scholarship and inquiry, but also has the connection with post-secondary education that is what they have been seeking as a further career. Those things are important programmatic initiatives that can happen at the graduate college level or at the academic disciplinary level through lots of different types of practices that would require some type of buy-in from academic leadership to say, hey, these positions may not be the first that you're thinking of because you're looking at all of the people who have positions at research universities, but they are also going to be very valuable. And if you look at them now, at least for a little while you're in the graduate program here, you can become very competitive to be in those positions in the long term. So that would be where I would say there's kind of a major opportunity. And then the other thing that I would just add is that there's a lot of good work happening about careers beyond the academy, but letting students know that sometimes you might not wish to be in an academic career from the time you start, but these are careers that you could be kind of turned on to when you realize that they're not the same as just the professors that you might see on the daily basis at your home institution. Other institutions probably do it differently, and other fields that are aligned but not identical to your own might have different models that have vastly different cultures that might be something that really resonates with the personal journey that they're on.
We've got some folks on our team who are working to develop a sort of instructional competencies credential with some training and various kinds of instructional competencies that would serve somebody well, whether they're going to teach in a research institution, in a teaching focus institution, or if they're going to be doing presentation related stuff in industry, doing training, delivering workshops. So trying to give grad students as well as postdocs an opportunity to be able to demonstrate that they have developed these competencies, especially because we're a large research institution and students in many disciplines teach mainly at the intro level. Our doc students don't necessarily have a lot of opportunities to teach in their own subdiscipline, more advanced courses. So this is a way we're trying to bolster their pedagogical training.
Yeah, that's really sort of helpful to think about and reminds me one of the things a colleague of mine when I started grad school, and I've had a long career in grad school, told me the only marketable skill I'll get as a political scientist is to take stat classes. So I took as many stat classes as I can. And yes, I've definitely been able to sort of make a career outside of the academy built on that. So, but yeah, there is a lot of, there are opportunities to do things other than join the academy in doctoral programs. And I think we would benefit our students by incorporating those ideas more and starting to teach to them. Igor, do you have another question?
Yeah, I have a question to John, and I'm just curious. Can you tell us more about the the data collection itself, because you mentioned that you have like very high 50% response rate. I was wondering whether it's like response every year or whether it's response from the first year to the last year of the cohort, because cohort-based, data collection, has is a bit different from like cross-sectional surveys that we run. So
yeah.
in terms of the response rate, I was wondering about that. And the second question is, when you share the data with kind of a broader campus communities and with graduate programs, I'm not sure if graduate students have access to the results. What are the differences between sharing the results from cohort-based studies? So do you wait for a certain amount of time to share the data, or you share right away? So can you tell more about that as well? So 2 questions, if I may.
Sure. Yeah. So the first question. Our cross-sectional response rates are very high, 75%. Usually they're highest on the first-year students. So they, brand new doctoral students love to get an email from the dean asking them, we actually mentioned this at our fall welcome, and we say, hey, there's a study, you should participate. It's now it's perpetuated through the students who've taken in the other cohorts. The panel attrition, so year 5, we're at 49% with our first cohort. So actually pretty good for a panel study. That attrition rate is pretty good. And then that's overall. So we started with about 1,000 students and we're down to about 500. And so overall our, we're hovering somewhere in the 55. If you were to look at all the populations, about 55% rate. Our non-respondent analysis indicates that engineering male international students, as in every other survey in the history of surveys, are the least likely to respond. And they're not differentially very different, but they are slightly different. We attribute that to our relationship we built with our students through not only surveys, but really through just constant relationship building. We do a once a year kind of result sharing where we bring them in and we give them food and then we share their results. We play games, we have them network with each other. We have a group just dedicated to participant engagement. I have students after a few years come and say, I want to work for you because I've been taking the survey and I'm a social scientist and I want to work on this. So there's a kind of self-perpetuating effect to this, and that I think students are happy to have their input capture, and then they're passing on to other students. Now, this isn't always true. We had after coming back from COVID, we also had a graduate student strike. And that year, I point out that cohort had like below 50%. Students were really angry, and they were angry at everyone. And we got that as well. They said, "Why are you doing this? There's more important things going on in the world." I agree, actually. So we manage that, and we try to be compassionate to the needs of our students and not do as many reminders. We built in a bunch of mechanisms to say, if you want to opt out of this forever, I respect your right to do that 100%. And so you can click on a little link and we'll never bother you again. So we have a number of things like that, which, I think help. The second question, I don't want to be too long-winded, sorry. How do we share this? So I mentioned how we share with students. I think one of the differences of a cohort study that's longitudinal is I pretty much refuse to share department level data with anyone. My dean won't even see it. And that's because, so I have lots of data for engineering. For classics, their cohort is 2. I still don't have 5 people, I don't think. So we have really maintained that our approach is actually not bottom up, but top down. It's that we are trying to understand disciplinary kind of consistent things, and eventually we might be able to drill down to a department level. This is frustrating to department chairs and to some faculty, but when I show them that there's really not a lot of disciplinary effects tests and most things. In the patterns, at least in the longitudinal patterns, they're kind of okay with that. The main difference being career stuff, where there are immense disciplinary differences. But everything else seems to have different baselines but similar patterns. So I think they're okay with that for now.
Awesome. I think we have time for about one more question from the audience. Well, not seeing any other questions. Maybe I'll pitch one more to the audience or to our panelists and ask, what are you looking at next? How are you sort of thinking about and approaching, better understanding graduate student and doctoral student experience? What projects are you working on?
Our team is doing a lot of thinking right now. I think COVID is something that sits with us. And so it's not over. And we're thinking about what the long-standing effects are. I don't think we're at a place to be thinking about, the immediate effects, but what are going to be some of the long-term effects in terms of academic fields, how people think about academic careers differently. Those are the kinds of things that going forward with our kind of research collective, we've generally talked about. I think there's a lot about how do we get at the questions related to who is desirous of going to grad school in a world that now is kind of facing the aftermath of the worst days of the pandemic, and that kind of meaning making. We want to be able to ask the right research questions and figure out how we can approach doing things that are useful not only to institutions that might be trying to make sure they can recruit students, but also to help students, achieve the goals that they want to achieve now that they might be looking at the world a little bit differently, and for fields of study that are looking at contributing to the global good.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about the impact of COVID, and I look forward to sort of looking at some of that research. But one of the things that really struck me in looking at that data was the percentage of doctoral students that expected, the pandemic to delay their degree progress and prolong their experience in grad school. I think seeing how both schools managed to continue to support them, and in addition to sort of how students are able to sort of better navigate those conditions, will be interesting to sort of follow over the next few years. John, Sherri, and Liz, anything you want to share with us?
I'm doing some kind of wonkish stuff right now, trying to figure out how we could revise our policies and practices related to graduate assistantships. Can we onboard people more efficiently so they get paid in August and not delaying? Can we put in place some policy or guidance that they get some paid vacation? Can we create some policies? I'm kind of researching institutions nationwide to see what could we change that would potentially reduce some pain points for our grad students and provide more support. And I think we mentioned this on our slide. We did adopt a policy where if grad students had a need to take a family or medical leave, they could at least keep their health insurance and their tuition waiver if they were able to maintain their academic progress. So we're trying to find things like that we can adjust to make things better for our graduate students and our graduate assistants.
Really important work.
Yeah, I'll point to three quick areas. So one, we're trying to do something similar for master's students. We think that they're woefully understudied. I mentioned the early career development work, and to sort of seeing we're finally having graduates, and so we want to follow them earlier into their careers. And then the last one is correlating our subjective measures of well-being to more clinical measures. So we have some scales of depression, anxiety, stress, and that we have been piloting, trying to see if we can be more specific about the mental health aspect of our study rather than just an overall measure of subjective well-being.
Yeah, having done some work in that space, I look forward to seeing that as well. Well, thank you, Nicholas, SuYeong, John, Sherri, and Liz for joining us today. I also want to thank Igor and John Douglas and all of our partner friends at the Center for Studies in Higher Education for sponsoring this panel. It's been a great privilege to be able to talk to you and learn more about your research. So thank you, everybody. Igor, back to you.
Yep, and thank you, Daniel, for leading the session. I think we had a great discussion, and I encourage everyone to watch presentations. I think they're great